harboring of human beings who are moved from one position or one location to another. And it always means that the person, or whether it's an adult or young person, does not consent to this whole idea of being moved from their one place to another. Oftentimes they are promised good life in the destination where they are being taken. For adults, we are finding many of those who are trafficked, it's either for jobs, employment, and obviously a promise of a better life. I'm sure you've heard about even Kenyans who are trafficked to the Gulf countries. And oftentimes we think trafficking involves people crossing borders from one country to the other, or actually being taken to another region. But the trafficking can be internal.
Okay, give us cases of child trafficking in Kenya.
Yes. There are cases, many cases. I possibly would not give you numbers of my fingers, but there are cases of children who are on the streets in Nairobi who have come from Tanzania, just your neighbor, or Uganda for that matter. I don't know whether you've heard, and possibly one of these days you'll invite us again to speak about a phenomenon of girls that have been trafficked from a region called Karamoja in the northern eastern part of Uganda that are found in a place called Isiri here in Nairobi, and they are being used in homes as domestic workers. So that's a very, very clear case.
How do they come here?
Interesting that you ask that question. How do they indeed come here? What we've been told, some of those we have interviewed, they cross the border, Busia border, and they come through buses, some in trucks, and whoever is behind the trafficking has promised them, a good life. They come for work. And so when they end here, how it actually turns into a case of trafficking, they run away from these places because, one, they're not paid. Two, because most are women, they are sexually abused, and you'll find they are pregnant. There are several cases of those who have had, we've seen with carrying babies. And some of our partners that run shelters actually do rescue them. Interestingly, when they are taken back to Uganda, they return in a few weeks or so. So it's a whole recruiting system. And going back to the definition, that's exactly what it is. That the recruiters warn them never to say who they are, because there's exchange of money, obviously, that is involved. But with regard to children who cross the borders from Tanzania, we also have worked around the Namanga border post. These are children who will cross, either they've come following grazing cows and they end up on the other side and they are not able to go back, or they are usually transported by the borders that cross them. Some of them are used to smuggle drugs and all kinds of things by adults. So yes, there is a big case here, or issue of trafficking in Kenya.
Andrew, allow me to ask, we, even with the campaigns, because there have been very many campaigns about stopping child trafficking, and usually it is to say stop child trafficking. But would we be able to look at it from a point of view of tighten the screws around the issues that would make individuals to traffic children, or that would make families to allow their children then to be taken? Economic issues, poverty issues, lack issues. Those are what we are talking about. Even the person who is trafficking, right? They are able to continue trafficking because in terms of security, in terms of making sure that the screws are tightened on things like corruption, those are not being done. Even in countries whereby trafficking may have been reduced, we'll find, and we can see that research has shown, that precedent has been set that there's 1, 2, 3 who've been arrested and charged and jailed. So the likelihood of another person doing it reduces significantly. So screws tightened there. We look at not making sure that all children who should be in school are in school. We look at making sure that parents who want to start businesses, for example, can do that. We look at people can get jobs. So if we tighten the screws on some of these things, don't we see that now this trafficking, because it happens as a result of all of these matters, all of these factors. If we tighten the screws around those elements, would we see that child trafficking then could reduce?
I agree, and I would say it's all the above. Efforts and interventions to end trafficking must both focus on preventive as well as redress, so that in the first place we ensure that the drivers, such as economic situations that push families to to collaborate, if you like, and being complicit in trafficking in persons, are addressed. But also, as you say, tighten the nuts so that the law enforcement agencies and other vigilant agencies are able, have capacity to detect trafficking, to stop it, to be able to investigate, to prosecute, to adjudicate, but also to provide protections and support for those who are survivors and victims of these violations. It's quite some ecosystem. You also say some people have been nabbed in the act, and that should be a deterrent. Funny how you'll find that it's rare that you catch the ringleader. Once in a while, they are prosecuted.
Yes.
But that's because trafficking has different limbs, and it's also advanced by many moving parts, including those that are oiled by corruption. It could be someone who has posted an advertisement that there is a job at a certain place. Then the victims are transported along a corridor. So it's also the transporter. When they get somewhere, they're harbored, they are put up in a facility. And then later on, they are told, you know what? The job we wanted to give you is not yet available. But can you do this meanwhile? You are coming to wait on tables, but can you dance for the patrons at this club?
And that was the original intention.
Yeah, so the people who deploy you, so it's a long chain, but there's somebody hovering above there who is faceless and who is not on the ground and who is funding all this and who is lining the pockets of everybody along this corridor. So it's not an easy thing to detect. And many times you'll find that law enforcement would want to just harvest the low-hanging fruits and say, this person is in the country illegally. We are going to charge you with offenses related to that. Or you are loitering with intent. So we are going, but they don't go behind the scenes to try to unearth how did they get here in the first place. Yeah, and that's how sometimes you find that trafficking goes through the cracks.
You have situations where young children, women, are actually taken against their will and transported to places where they then serve in conditions that are probably akin to slavery.
Yeah, the answer is yes. We have very many of those situations.
So they are abducted.
Well, yeah, you could call it that because, like Andrew was saying, the level of consent in these situations is also relative. Because if you've been told you're going to be taken to wait on tables and you end up in a brothel dancing and maybe serving the patrons of that facility, that's not what was originally the intention. And many cases of slavery, because say for example, I'll go back to the Karamajong girls example, where they're in houses, they have no say in whatsoever jobs they are given. They will work long hours, maybe no food at all, and they are not paid. So if there's anything that goes wrong, you just find your way, and that's how they are found after they've been thrown out of these households. So then they are loitering on the streets with babies begging, and they cannot speak the language here, so they are nabbed and maybe even repatriated back to the country. But you never know who was behind it. So yes, there are many cases, and we've seen most of them, but there are also those cases that are outside Kenya. I'm sure you've read in the papers, you've heard about the stories of the domestic workers who flock the Gulf countries. And either, if you are lucky, you come back scarred, but most die and they throw themselves off buildings and things like that. So yes, they are forced to do what they were not even intended to do in the first place. This is now in the case of adults who are able to, even in many cases, go as if legally, because I think there's a phenomenon like labor exportation or something like that, where countries have agreed and they have signed bilateral labor agreements with country X, and they are saying, we'll send you a number of workers, and there are employment agencies that are involved. But that's another topic altogether. But if we focus on the issue of trafficking, we are looking at the illegality of it, but also the criminality of it, because it's really criminal.
But the real criminality is where all this begins. If people were not poor,
Yes.
because poverty renders you helpless. You actually even can't even make a decision on your own. Somebody's going to demand and make a decision for you.
Yes.
And on this continent, we seem to have accepted that some of us will be poor and that some of us will do exactly what we're saying. Because I'm saying this from the perspective that I do not see this coming to an end. There's an unless, of course, to it. But I don't see it coming to an end because it's not something that people seem to object to. Not really. Because in many cases, there are people who willingly allow their children or their relatives to be in this very situation that we are describing.
And I agree with you to a large extent, because for as long as we have disparities between the rich and the poor, and there's no effort to bridge that gap, there's also the poverty of the mind, of not being really aware that could be a trafficking case where families and communities are giving away their children knowingly that they could end up in these situations. However, I think to say that it can't end and it will not end could also be a defeatist kind of, because I'm also thinking if you save even one person or two, you have saved lives.
Grace, there's an unless. I said there's an unless.
Yes.
Because you do not see this problem in countries where there is a strong push to ensure, one, that people actually get to go to school, children.
Absolutely.
Yes.
For example, if I can ask, do we see children who are in school actively from January to December being trafficked?
No.
Exactly. The children who are being trafficked are not in school. Isn't it?
Agreed.
So if the systems, for example, have been set up, like CT is saying, to ensure that every child of school-going age is actually in school, if we make sure that parents, families, guaranteed by government, have some form of economic activity that will guarantee shelter, food, clothing, do we see people who are at least, I'm not even talking about well-off, that are able to afford even 2 meals a day and a shelter? Do we see children from those homes being trafficked?
No, not at all. And precisely that's why we are saying if the laws and policies that exist are enforced, and what you're saying precisely is that all children are in school, they are monitored, that you report day one of first term, and you know if you are not in school for 2 weeks following, there's a concern and a follow-up. But is that happening? And that's why we're saying if everybody plays their role, even at the lower levels. For example, one of the the activities or the interventions we have had with Uganda in some of the target districts, the communities decided to establish a bylaw in their community and say any family that will be found sending their children to the sugarcane plantations will be punished. So that's community taking the law into
enforcement.
Enforcement. And then districts are also developing ordinances. That is in Uganda. Here in Kenya, the counties that we've worked in, Kwale, Mombasa, Bungoma, Kajiado, they've also decided to develop their standalone child labor policies where they're saying this is zero tolerance to child labor. Last week we were in Mombasa, the governor has taken the lead. And
so what is it? So what are they doing about it? So it's zero tolerance to child labor. But the root cause is all known. Yes. Are they saying that we are now coming up with programs that will ensure there's social safety nets? For example, with Kwale, Bungoma, are they any of them saying that they're supporting families?
They are doing that. It's something that has been continuously happening with different partners, making sure that they are each other's keeper within the communities. They have child volunteers that go to the communities that report cases. Now, the families are on alert. It may not happen tomorrow, but there is at least an effort going into that direction.
Is there a program that is making sure that this family shall afford to buy uniform for their children when they're going to school? That this family shall be able to feed their children, or there's school feeding that will then attract the children to go to school. Because if you don't provide those, if you're not addressing the root cause, then all these are things of families monitoring one another. You're monitoring what? If my child has been sent home because of lack of school fees, monitor all you want.
I would agree, and I would agree. That question has been pondered and turned around so many times. The most famous and recent one is in 2022 when the global conference on the elimination of child labor, and I say child labor because most people who are trafficked are deployed in labor. It was for the first time held on the African soil in Durban, South Africa, and the focus was on Africa. Why is it that so many years since we passed these conventions and started implementing actions, child labor and trafficking are still on the rise? And they came up with some pretty clear and targeted blueprints which go towards preventive and redress. And the first one was you need to ensure that the economic situation of communities is something that would ensure that they do not fall into these traps. So social protection, universal access to social protection. The other was access to education for all children. The other one was about data. We do not know, we cannot put our finger and tell you the magnitude or the sheer scale of child labor and trafficking, because we are not used to undertaking research and analyzing it to develop a better understanding of the problem we are dealing with. But this conference was also informed by studies that found that most children in child labor are in the agriculture sector. How have we been addressing issues there before? You asked what are they doing in these counties and what is the national government doing? The government of Kenya, through the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection and supported by the ILO, has a draft national policy on the elimination of child labor that takes in, among other targeted strategies, the Durban call to action that arose from the Durban meeting of 2022. And part of it is to ensure that there's social protection incrementally for children who are in need. So these things are being addressed. But there's also the component of financing for service provision and for administration of child labor, you'll find that many times it is left to a small ministry. I'm not saying small, but in terms of the budgetary allocation, the Ministry of Labor, and many times in many sub-Saharan countries, they are told, that is your monkey, deal with it. How can we ensure that there's a whole of government approach? If most children in child labor are in the agriculture sector, can we give greater mandates to these ministries also, and also the one of education, to have clear mandates to address child labor?
Thank you. Grace Banya, Project Manager, ILO CAPSA, and Andrew Odete, Engagement and Partnerships Building Officer at ILO CAPSA. They've been our guests talking about child labor and child trafficking in Kenya. It's 9:01. Good morning.
This November.